Next we have Natalya Naumenko. She's going to talk about the political economy of the Ukrainian famine.
Okay. Thanks for having me. It's a great honor. And please ask questions along with my talk. It will help me if I forget to mention something. This talk. Okay. So this talk is originally designed for 1.5 hours. I will try to fit it into 25 minutes, so we'll see how it goes. By the beginning of 20th century, Europe was free from peacetime famine. It was simply rich and developed enough to make sure that in the lack of conflict, European citizens had enough to eat. In 1928, Soviet Union belonged to top 30 wealthiest countries in the world, and its economy was rapidly growing. Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union at the time, was famous for its grain production and exports. It was called the grain basket of the country. However, in 1933, without any conflict to trigger the famine, almost 10% of Ukrainian population died of starvation and hunger-induced disease. How is it possible? Historians offer 3 explanations: bad weather, poor economic policies, and genocide. So in my work, I will explore these explanations, we'll evaluate which one is true and which one is false, and we'll try to quantify their impact on famine mortality. And here's what I find. Here's what I find. The data do not support negative weather shock. Second, poor economic policies, in particular collectivization of agriculture and the lack of favored industries, significantly contributed to famine mortality. Collectivization explains 31 to 56% of excess deaths in 1933. And finally, there is evidence that ethnic Ukrainians were discriminated against. Within Ukraine, districts with higher share of ethnic Ukrainians experienced higher mortality, even after controlling for exposure to poor economic policies. In addition, ethnic Ukrainians were more exposed to poor economic policies. They were more collectivized and they had fewer favored industries. However, I do not find evidence that there was a difference in enforcement of economic policies. That there was with ethnic composition. That is, I don't find evidence that Ukrainian collectives were treated worse than other ethnic collectives. What's wrong with this clicker? Okay, there is a huge literature. I will skip it. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk a bit about the background of the famine. I will describe my data, and then I will study these 3 explanations: weather, economic policies, and genocide. So the background. Before its industrialization, Soviet economy was more or less a market economy with restrictions, but foodstuffs were produced by individual peasants. They were paid taxes to the government, and after paying taxes, they were free to sell their produce on the market. A number of competing organizations procured grain from the peasants for the government. But by the late 1920s, Stalin consolidated power within the Soviet Union, and he started his industrialization campaign. In late 1929, collectivization and decolonization campaigns were launched. Peasants were forced to give up their land, their livestock, their implements, and to join collective farms. By 1932, approximately 70% of the rural households belonged to the collectives. In theory, work done by the members of the collectives was supposed to be recorded, and at the end of the year, after the harvest and after it's been shared to the government, the remaining produce should have been divided among members in proportion to the amount of work done. In reality, these newly created collective farms were remarkably poorly managed. Collective farm chairmen didn't have any managerial experience and sometimes didn't have agricultural experience. The books were kept haphazardly, and often at the end of the year, the remaining produce was divided among members in proportion to the number of eaters in the members' families. Trading of foodstuffs was mostly banned, and the government procured food from the countryside and rationed it in the cities among urban dwellers. According to historical accounts, the years of 1939 and 1932 saw a remarkably poor harvest, according to historians, due to a strong negative weather shock. And the peak of the famine happened in the winter and spring of 1933 after the 1932 harvest. So in 1933, the government had to adjust the system. Collective farm members were allowed to have some livestock, to keep some livestock, and to keep small private plots of land. And the produce from this land, they could sell on the markets in the cities, so-called kolkhoz markets, where prices were not controlled by the government. So the government allowed some small private sector in agriculture. However, collectivization campaign continued, and by 1939, almost all peasants belonged to the collective farms. My data. I collected disaggregated mortality data from the archives in Moscow. I have a district-level data set mortality for Ukrainian districts. Districts were the smallest administrative units, similar to counties in the US. All my pre-famine data and policy proxy measures are coming from books found from published sources found in the libraries in Kyiv, Kharkov, United States, and even Canada. All in all, I have constructed two data sets. I have a cross-section of Ukrainian districts for which I know mortality and all pre-famine characteristics. And I have a slightly more aggregated short panel of Ukrainian regions, in Russian they were called okrugs, for which I know also 1927 and 1928 mortality. This is how the original mortality data look. This is the mortality on the Ukrainian map. So these are districts. Thick lines are province borders, and the blue dots are province capitals as of 1933. And the darker the color, the higher the mortality was. There are several interesting features you can see on this map. First, the average mortality in 1933 was extremely high, 63 per thousand. For comparison, mortality in a non-famine year in 1927 was approximately 18 per thousand. In addition, there was a huge variation in mortality within Ukraine, from 8 per thousand to more than 200 per thousand. In particular, there was a district where, according to official records, mortality was more than 240 per thousand, meaning that, according to official records, more than a quarter of the population died in 1 year. Okay, now let's study the weather. This is a talk about famine, so before I show my regressions, I will show a bit of the aggregate data. To evaluate the presumed weather shock, I estimate grain production function using pre-revolutionary, pre-1917 data, and then I predict how much grain there would have been produced in Ukraine during 1920s and early 1930s if production function didn't change. And I find that if production function didn't change, then in 1931 and 1932, grain production would have been roughly equal to the 1925-1929 average. Therefore, I conclude that the weather was not that bad. Weather predicts that the grain harvest should have been roughly equal to the 1920s average. In addition, I've reported harvest, the harvest reported by the government, is very close to the predicted harvest. Therefore, I think Soviet statisticians, when they were creating estimates of the harvest, took weather into account in their estimates. However, there is a strong evidence that the true harvest was much lower than reported by the government. I use reports by collective farms, and so this graph, the blue line plots the average yield reported by the government, and the red dots are the yields reported by collective farms, and they're much lower than the average yield. And if I calculate yields that individual peasants should have had to get the average reported by the government, then the individual peasants, assuming that the sown area was divided in proportion to collectivization rate, then the individual yields are much higher, or are too high, unbelievably high. So it is possible. So the harvest reported by the government, if we believe collective farm reports, was probably overstating the true harvest. There is no way for me to know the true harvest, but I can make some simple corrections. I can assume that I can believe the collective farms and assume that collective farms had yields as they reported. And I can assume that individual peasants had yields as reported by the government, because these yields are consistent with the weather. And then when I correct harvest using the simple procedure, and again assuming that sown area was divided in proportion with collectivization rate, then the 1932 harvest is almost 40% lower than the 1920s average. And when I calculate rural food availability, the difference between harvest and grain collections by the government, then it's more than 50% lower than during the 1920s. So here is your famine. To conclude, this section was designed to convince you that weather does not explain the drop in harvest, but there is a strong evidence to believe that there was a drop in harvest. So next, because the weather does not seem to be the reason of the famine, I turn to economic policies. I concentrate on 3 policies that affected grain production and distribution. Collectivization, measured as the share of rural households in collective farms in 1930. Procurement, I proxy by the distance from a district to a railroad. Presumably, the further away the district was from a railroad, the more expensive it was to extract grain from it for the government. And food distribution, measured as a number of Group A workers per capita. According to Soviet classification, industry was divided into Group A, production of the means of production, and Group B, production of consumer goods. And production of the means of production was more important for industrialization. Therefore, workers in Group A industries, such as coal mining, steel production, and so on, had higher chance of being put in a higher priority supply list. So they were better fed. So as I mentioned before, I have 2 main data sets. I have a cross-section of districts, and I have more aggregated panel of regions. And there are, for me, it's impossible to know exactly what's better to use, the cross-section of districts or these regions. Therefore, in subsequent estimates, I just report estimates using both of these data sets. So for my cross-section of regions, I estimate a simple or less regression. I regress mortality on the policy intensity proxy, controlling for district characteristics and province fixed effects. There are two main possible problems with these estimates. First, reverse causality. For example, what if peasants join collective farms because of the famine and not the other way around? However, this concern can be eliminated because I measure all my policies before the famine in 1930. And the second concern is omitted variable bias. For example, what if poor peasants had more incentives to join collective farms, and they also were dying at a higher rate during the famine? And so it's not collectivization that drives the results, but some omitted factor like wealth of the district. And to account for the second concern, I just try to think of every possible omitted variable that could have been driving my results and control for it. So I control for grain production per capita before the famine in 1925. I also control for alternative food sources, livestock and potatoes. In addition, I include a lot of proxies for wealth and economic development, rural literacy rate, population density, urbanization, value of agricultural equipment per capita. And I control for differences in agroclimatic conditions using Polissy region indicator. Polissy was a region in the northern Ukraine that had that was just a different agroclimatic zone. In addition to the cross-section, I also construct a short diff and diff estimate where I regress mortality in region I in year T on the intensity of the economic policy interacted with the famine dummy, and again include region controls interacted with the famine dummy. In addition, I include year fixed effects and region fixed effects to account for potential heterogeneity among regions. So here are my estimates. On the cross-section of districts, I see that collectivization is associated with a higher 1933 mortality. I also see that more Group A workers per capita are associated with a lower mortality, and they don't find a different effect of the railroads on mortality. For comparison, I also show the estimates on the cross-section of regions, and these estimates are much higher. The collectivization coefficient is almost double, and I think this is because when I use larger units of observation, I aggregate away the measurement error. So my estimates are higher. In addition, in the region-level data set, I lose the effect from Group A industries on mortality. And I think this is because they are too aggregated, because regions that had more Group A industries also produced less grain, and when I control for grain production per capita, I just lose the effect from the Group A industries because there is not enough variation that allows me to distinguish the two. Finally, my diff and diff estimates are very close to the cross-section, to the estimates on the cross-section of the regions. Again, collectivization is associated with higher mortality. I have a battery of robustness checks. I don't have a button to click on one, but yeah. So the important one is that I compare districts that had policy intensity measures above the median and below the median, conditional on a set of very simple controls on price fixed effects, grain production per capita and livestock per capita, and I find the districts that had collectivization above the median and below the median are very similar when I take into account these very simple controls. So I think my assumption that conditional on a small set of baseline controls policy intensities were as good as random is likely satisfied. Next, I tried to investigate the mechanisms of why collectivization was increasing mortality. And first, I look at the aggregated data again. I suggest you look at the bottom line. Here, I know collectivization rate. I know yields reported by collective farms. I assume that yields individual peasants had are as reported by the government. Using that, I can calculate how much grain was produced by individual peasants and by collective farms. And this bottom line shows is that 30% of peasants, individual peasants, produced more than 40% of grain in 1932, if I believe the yield figures. And even though higher share of harvest was extracted from collective farms, when I use the harvest figures produced by collective farms and individual peasants, in per capita terms, collective farms delivered less grain to the government than individual peasants. So 30% of peasants, individual peasants, delivered 38% of grain to the government. Again, if you believe these figures. Of course, it's just the aggregate estimates, so there are the aggregate data, so there are many potential problems with that. But I think this might be an evidence that collectivization was deadly not because the government just took all the grain produced by the collectives. Something else was going on. In addition, yeah. Okay. Unfortunately, there is no disaggregated data on yield or harvest produced by the collective farms. But I have some evidence to show that collectivization was associated with a drop in production. This table is designed to show that collectivization was associated with a drop in livestock in 1930. In addition, the increase in mortality in more collectivized districts seemed to be driven by the size of the collective farms. The larger the collective farms were, the higher the mortality was. And I think this is probably because the larger the collective farms were, the more difficult it was to manage them and to monitor the effort of the members. Finally, collectivization is also associated with a drop in sown area already in 1930. I think this is all evidence that suggests that collectivization led to drop in production. I also estimate the total impact of collectivization on death toll in 1933, and I show that collectivization explains 31 to 56% of excess deaths in 1933, and the allocation of favorite industries explains. It depends on how you construct counterfactual, but if you put a factory of 2,000 workers in every district, then you will reduce deaths by 1%, so it's not that large. Finally, to the genocide. This table is designed to show that ethnic Ukrainians seem to be dying at a higher rate. Within Ukraine, districts that had higher share of ethnic Ukrainians experienced higher mortality, even after controlling for the intensity of economic policies. So in column 2, the coefficient loses statistical significance, but I actually cannot reject that the coefficients in column 1 and column 2 are the same. I also show that the similar but stronger results I get if I use, instead of districts, the larger regions. This is the results on a cross-section of regions, and these are the estimates on using different regions. I also document that ethnic Ukrainians were more exposed to collectivization. The more Ukrainians there were in the district, the higher the collectivization rate was, and all ethnicities except Russians and Jews had fewer favorite industries. Finally, to study the enforcement of economic policies, I looked at the interaction between ethnic Ukrainians and policy intensity measures. And I don't see that this interaction coefficient has any statistically significant effect on mortality. Therefore, I think the enforcement of these policies didn't vary with ethnic composition. One important point I want to make is that the higher collectivization of ethnic Ukrainians was not driven by the preference of Ukrainians for collectivization. I cannot click on the button, but if I could, then I would have shown you the table that showed that in 1927, more Ukrainian regions were significantly less collectivized. So before collectivization was forced on population, Ukrainians didn't show any preference for it. To conclude, I have shown that there is no evidence of the strong negative weather shock, but poor economic policies, in particular collectivization of agriculture, explain at least 30% of excess deaths in 1933, and that there is evidence that ethnic Ukrainians were discriminated against. Thank you.
This was fascinating. I guess that the questions I have immediately had to do with what one means by genocide. And to play that out, again, my understanding is that the interpretation of the genocide was to destroy Ukrainian independence movements. It seems to me that if that is the rationale, it would be interesting to see whether or not there's, and I don't know if the data exists, was there correlation between what's known about independence movements and during the Russian Civil War and differences in the spatial distribution of mortality. Because if I understood what you did, and obviously I was perusing your job market paper in real time, so I didn't have a chance to read it. If these are just dummy variables or measures of fractions, I think you want to excavate below that to say something about what could have been going on in Stalin and others' minds. And it would seem to me there are data on something about the locations of the independence activities during the Civil War.
Yeah, personally, when I started this, I was sure that there was no genocide at all, and I still don't like this term. I like term discrimination much better for several reasons. First, nobody was ever able to find a single document that was explicitly targeting ethnic Ukrainians. And all other Stalin's atrocities are extremely well documented. The purges, there are plans, reports, instructions, and so on. However, nobody was ever able to find something targeting Ukrainians. Second, I wanted to look at the Civil War, but unfortunately, all the data I have, all the Civil War maps, are very aggregated. So I plan to look at the voting in 1917, but it is difficult, and mostly because of the data.
So I have two questions about the Ukrainian results. What you call discrimination, could it be actually an artifact that Ukrainian ethnicity were settled in those regions which were deemed by the states as agroclimatically more sort of favorable to collectivization? So did you look at the spatial distribution to see if there is any evidence to suggest that? And the other question is, when you look at the mortality rates for Ukrainians, for regions where there were ethnic Ukrainians, are you controlling for the intensity of collectivization? I think that's something I missed in the regression.
Yes. So, yes, I control for intensity of economic policies, and even after controlling for it, Ukrainians still die at a higher rate. And the standard argument is that Ukrainians were dying not because of their ethnicity, but because they lived in grain-producing areas, and grain-producing areas were hit by the famine. However, in all my estimates, I control for grain production per capita in 1925. So this basic argument is taken care of. But even after controlling for it, Ukrainians still seem to die at a higher rate.
Last question.
Скажите, пожалуйста, можно ли из ваших исследований сделать какую-либо мораль для современной теории природной ренты?
Теории?
Природная рента, раздача просто денег, современной теории, что природная рента, понимаете, да?
No, I'm sorry. I'm a historian.
Она не говорит по-русски, да? Вот, то есть то, что каждому жителю положено какое-либо, независимо от него, что положено какое-либо экономическое вознаграждение за то, что он гражданин. Понимаете, да, современная теория. Вот, и как-то коррелирует ли это с некими действиями по тому, что было на Украине и привело к голоду?
No, I wouldn't want to make any conclusions about the rent distribution in this context. Sorry.
All right, let's